Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. Today we're taking a look, a deep dive that is, at the Essential Drucker. This one was actually flagged by a lot of you, our listeners, and I'm pretty excited to dig in because Drucker, I think it's safe to say, is one of those foundational figures when we think about management.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
His ideas have had such a lasting impact on how we understand organizations and how we lead them.
Yeah, his insights are really timeless. And I think that's what makes the Essential Drucker so valuable even today. It's like a distillation of his most important ideas, kind of like a cheat sheet to understanding how management has evolved, its role in society, and, the challenges and opportunities it faces moving forward. So what do you think? You ready to jump in?
I'm ready. Let's dive in.
Okay, great. So one of the things that really struck me right off the bat is Drucker's idea that modern management, it wasn't like, this grand theory that somebody just dreamt up one day.
It really wasn't. He calls it a practical invention that was born out of this increasing need for specialization.
Yeah, right. And he uses the example of Siemens back in, what was it, 1867, when they hired a university-trained engineer. His name was Friedrich von Hefner-Alteneck.
Right. And that seemingly small decision kind of kicked off this trend of breaking down work into these specialized departments, like research and development, manufacturing, marketing, sales, finance, accounting, even HR.
All those departments that we just take for granted now, right?
Exactly. I mean, it's hard to imagine an organization functioning without them today.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because a lot of that specialization and the departments that emerged to handle it really took shape rapidly in the years leading up to World War I.
So it's interesting because when you think about it, it's easy to assume those departments just appeared naturally.
Right.
But Drucker really emphasizes the deliberate effort that went into creating those functions. It was, management saying, okay, we need a specific group of people to handle this increasingly complex aspect of the business. And it makes sense. But then there was another crucial development happening around the same time.
Oh, absolutely. The application of management principles to manual labor through training.
And that was a huge shift, wasn't it? I mean, can you talk a little bit about what drove that change, particularly during the war years?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Wartime urgency, especially in the U.S. and the U.K., really forced companies to find a way to quickly train massive numbers of unskilled workers, as a matter of national necessity, of survival, really. And so you saw this wide adoption of Frederick W. Taylor's scientific management, which emphasized breaking down complex tasks into these simple, repeatable operations.
Right, kind of like an assembly line approach.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that Drucker makes this point about how this very practical application of management principles to training, it kind of defied what traditional economic theory had set up to that point.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, Adam Smith, way back when, he observed that it took centuries for countries to really develop those deep labor traditions and expertise. But what systematic training did was it showed that even low-wage countries, countries without those long-standing traditions, they could suddenly become really efficient competitors.
I see. So it kind of leveled the playing field in a way.
Yeah, in a sense it did. It showed that it wasn't just about raw materials or technology. It was about how you manage and train people to use those things effectively.
So that's a huge paradigm shift, right? It changes how you think about economic development.
Oh, absolutely. And this whole focus on training, it didn't stop there. It continued to evolve during World War II, and then later it was adopted by Japan and South Korea.
Right.
They lacked those deep labor traditions, so they strategically applied these management principles to training. And it became this cornerstone of their incredible economic growth in the decades that followed. And that really highlights management, not just as administration or bureaucracy,
right,
but as this really powerful force that shapes entire economies.
So the takeaway there is management is not just about the nuts and bolts of running a business. It's also about developing the capabilities of people and, enabling societies to thrive. And Drucker makes this even more explicit when he looks at World War II, right?
Absolutely. And that was a really stark example of the power of management.
Because on the face of it, it looks like Germany had all these advantages.
It seemed that way. Better strategy, shorter supply lines.
Right. But the Allies ended up winning, and a big part of that was because of, superior management. And it's kind of mind-blowing when you think about the sheer scale of what the Allies, particularly the U.S., had to accomplish.
The U.S. produced just this unbelievable amount of war material. And then they had to figure out how to transport all of that stuff all over the globe. I mean, that was a logistical nightmare, but they made it work.
And it wasn't just logistics, right? There was the whole mobilization of the workforce, the coordination of different industries. I mean, it was a management undertaking on a scale that the world had never really seen before.
Right. And the success of the Allies really kind of hammered home this point that management wasn't just, some nice to have. It was vital. It was essential to achieving strategic objectives.
So it's almost as if management itself became a decisive strategic advantage.
In a way, it did. And with that realization, this widespread understanding of the importance of management, it's no surprise that management then emerged as a distinct field of study.
Right.
Something that could be systematically analyzed, taught, and improved upon. I mean, the war demonstrated that management wasn't just intuition or experience. It was a body of knowledge and practices that could be learned and refined.
And it's still evolving, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But one of the things that Drucker does that I find so fascinating is that he doesn't stop at the internal workings of an organization. He brings up this crucial point, which is the idea of management as a social function.
And that raises some really important questions, doesn't it, about accountability?
Yes, exactly. As management becomes more widespread and more influential, you have to start asking, who should management be accountable to? What are they responsible for? And, what gives them the authority and legitimacy to make the decisions that they do?
Right. It's not just about the bottom line anymore. It's about the impact that management decisions have on society as a whole.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think this is where, this idea of social responsibility comes in.
Oh, absolutely.
Which is something that we're still grappling with today.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And one of the things Drucker argues is that management has this fundamental obligation to enable not just the enterprise to grow and develop, but also the individuals within the organization.
Right. It's about investing in people.
Exactly.
So it's not solely about the company's profits. It's also about the growth and potential of the people who are actually making it all happen.
Right. He stresses the concept of organizations as these continuous learning and teaching institutions.
I like that.
Yeah, where training and development are not like optional extras. They're essential components.
Yeah.
And it's not just about giving people skills, it's about helping them grow as human beings.
Yeah, and I think communication plays a really big role in all of this, right?
Absolutely.
Everyone needs to be aligned on the goals. They need to understand their individual roles. They need to feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves.
Drucker really emphasizes that. The significance of clear communication, fostering individual responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you hit the nail on the head. It's that sense of belonging, of purpose that's so important.
Yeah. But then there's also this whole question of, how we measure performance.
Oh, absolutely. And Drucker argues that we need to go beyond just output and, traditional financial results.
Right. Because the bottom line doesn't tell the whole story.
Right.
There are other things that we need to be looking at, like market position, innovation, employee development, quality. And this isn't just for for-profit businesses either.
No, it applies equally to nonprofits.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the specific metrics might differ.
Right, because they have different missions.
Right. But the principle is the same.
You have to measure what matters.
And you have to measure in a way that reflects the organization's overall health and effectiveness.
Right. I'm reminded of this quote from Drucker where he says that, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he says that results only exist on the outside.
That's such a great point.
A satisfied customer, a patient who recovers, a student who learns something, those are the real indicators of success.
And within the organization, you only have costs.
Right, right. So how should organizations be thinking differently about the data they collect internally? Are traditional internal metrics potentially misleading if they don't correlate with the impact the organization is having in the real world?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
I mean, if all results are external, as Drucker suggests,
Right.
then you have to start questioning the value of all the data you're collecting internally if it doesn't connect to those external results.
Right. And that's a really powerful way to think about it because it forces you to always be looking outward, to be focusing on the impact that your organization is having in the world.
Exactly.
Okay. So let's shift gears a little bit. Drucker also talks a lot about the importance of clearly defining the business.
This is such a crucial point.
And I think it's something that a lot of people overlook, particularly when things are going well.
It's easy to become complacent when you're successful. But Drucker's argument is that asking the question, what is our business, should not be this last-ditch effort when a company is failing.
Right. It should be an ongoing conversation,
Exactly.
especially when things are going well.
Especially when things are going well. He even goes so far as to say that success itself can be a trap. Well, if you're not constantly questioning your core assumptions, if you're not constantly looking for ways to adapt and evolve, success can lead to complacency.
And ultimately to obsolescence.
Right. And he gives this really great example of Cadillac during the Depression. They were struggling, and they redefined themselves not as selling just transportation, but as selling status.
Right. And that completely changed their trajectory.
It did. I mean, it was a fundamental shift in perspective that saved the company. And he points to other examples as well, like Willow Creek Community Church, tailoring its services to the unmet needs of their community, or that Catholic hospital chain in the Southwest that successfully navigated Medicare cuts.
They did that by focusing on the business of delivering health.
Right. And the Daisy Scouts program is another great example. They thrived by seeing demographic changes and the rise of TV viewing as opportunities rather than threats.
So it's really about understanding your core purpose and your customer in the broadest sense.
Absolutely. And being willing to adapt and innovate based on their evolving needs.
Right. So it's not just about reacting to change. It's about anticipating it. It's about being proactive. And I think this proactive mindset also extends to the role of nonprofit boards, which is something that Drucker talks about as well.
And he makes some really interesting observations about that. He noticed that nonprofit boards often function more effectively than their for-profit counterparts. And one of the reasons he gives for that is that nonprofit CEOs are often more clearly accountable to their boards.
And those boards are less likely to become passive or rubber stamp whatever the CEO wants to do.
Exactly. And he attributes that to a couple of things, like the fact that nonprofit directors are often significant financial contributors themselves.
Right.
And they also tend to have this deep personal commitment to the organization's mission.
A lot of them have probably served as volunteers at some point, so they really understand the organization from the ground up.
Exactly. And that makes them far more engaged and less likely to just defer to the CEO.
Right. And I think that leads nicely into another critical area that Drucker addresses, and it's one that I think is more relevant today than ever, and that's the whole question of management's responsibility to society.
Yeah, that's a big one.
We hear a lot about corporate social responsibility and ESG and all these things, but Drucker was talking about this decades ago.
He was ahead of his time in a lot of ways. And one of his key arguments is that businesses aren't these isolated entities operating in a vacuum.
They're part of society.
They're integral parts of society. And they're inevitably affected by social problems, whether they acknowledge it or not.
And he even goes so far as to say that management has a vested interest in a healthy society.
Absolutely.
Because if society is struggling, ultimately businesses will struggle too.
Right. He introduces this principle, which is that you are responsible for your impacts, whether you intended them or not.
Right. It's about taking responsibility for the consequences of your actions.
And those consequences can be social, environmental, you name it. And it's not just about mitigating negative impacts either.
He also talks about social innovation.
He does.
The idea that you can actually turn social problems into business opportunities.
And he gives that great example of Ford Motor Company's $5 a day wage back in 1913.
Which was a radical idea at the time.
It was unheard of. I mean, you're talking about a time when wages were much, much lower. And it seemed counterintuitive. I mean, why would you want to increase your labor costs like that?
Right.
But they did it to address these major social issues, labor unrest, high employee turnover. And what's fascinating is that it actually worked.
It did.
It led to lower labor costs in the long run.
Yeah.
They had more loyal employees, more productive employees. They were able to achieve market dominance.
And they ultimately made more money despite the fact that their material costs were going up.
It's a perfect example of how addressing social needs can actually be good for business. And Drucker is very clear about this. He says a healthy business requires a healthy society. And if you ignore the problems in society, they're not going to go away. They're just going to get worse.
Right. So it's about taking a holistic view, a long-term view.
Exactly. But he also cautions against overextension,
Yeah. What does he mean by that?
Well, he says, don't take on social responsibilities that the enterprise can't actually support economically.
Right. You can't save the world if you go bankrupt trying.
Right.
And that applies to nonprofits just as much as for-profits, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The point is to maintain the institution's ability to perform its core mission, whatever that mission may be.
Right. I mean, it's kind of like the oxygen mask on the airplane analogy.
Exactly.
You have to take care of yourself first before you can help others.
Exactly. And then he gets into this whole other really interesting area, which is executive compensation.
Okay.
It's this sensitive topic.
Yeah. It's always been a hot button issue.
Always.
Yeah.
And Drucker, he critiques this idea of excessive executive compensation.
Yeah, he's not a fan.
He sees it as driven largely by status rather than any, real economic contribution. And he argues that these practices can actually be quite harmful.
Harmful in what way?
Well, socially,
Mm.
psychologically. He even uses this ethical principle, primum non nocere.
Which means first, do no harm. Right.
Exactly.
Okay.
And he suggests that it's a good ethical guideline for managers.
It's a good reminder that ethical considerations should be front and center in management?
Absolutely.
Okay. So, shifting gears a little bit again, Drucker then talks about the evolving paradigms of management, which are those foundational assumptions that really shape the entire field.
And he argues that it's really crucial for anyone who's involved in management to understand these assumptions.
Right, because they often operate beneath the surface.
Exactly. And when those assumptions change, it has a huge impact on how we think about organizations and how we manage them.
Okay. So, what are some of these traditional assumptions that have been so influential?
Well, one of them is this idea that management is primarily business management. Another one is this belief that there is one ideal organizational structure, that there's like a one-size-fits-all solution. And then there's the assumption that there's one best way to manage people, kind of a universal recipe for leadership.
And Drucker challenges all of these, right?
He does, starting with the idea of a single right organizational structure. He says there's no such thing.
Right.
Organizations are tools, and each one has its own strengths, limitations, and it depends on the task, the environment, even the timing.
Right. You wouldn't use a hammer to screw in a screw.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And he even addresses this whole notion of the end of hierarchy, which was a popular idea.
Yeah, I remember that.
And he points out that different types of work, like research, for example, might actually require different structures.
So sometimes you need that strict functional specialization, but other times you need more collaboration. You need people working in teams from the very beginning.
Right. So it's not about finding the one perfect structure. It's about choosing the structure that best aligns with the goals and activities of the organization.
Right. So the takeaway there is context matters.
Exactly. And then he talks about this assumption that management is business management.
Yeah, and I think that assumption has led to a lot of blind spots.
It has. It's led to a lot of misguided attempts to apply business management principles to non-business organizations, like government agencies or nonprofits. And he also talks about this idea that a company's own research lab should and can produce everything it needs.
Right.
And that everything it produces will be directly utilized by its industry.
Right. It's kind of an inward-looking perspective.
It is. And to illustrate this, he uses that fascinating cautionary tale of Bell Labs and the transistor.
Oh, yeah.
One of the most groundbreaking inventions of the 20th century.
Yeah.
But they initially undervalued it. They even gave it away for free because they didn't really see its wider applications outside of the telephone industry. And the irony is that a lot of the innovations that later revolutionized the telephone system, they came from outside Bell Labs.
So it's like they missed the forest for the trees.
Exactly.
Mm.
And that highlights this increasing interconnectedness of technologies across different industries.
Right.
Which means companies have to be constantly learning and adapting.
And Drucker also challenges this assumption of fixed end uses where the competition is only between suppliers of the same type of product.
Right.
And he uses the example of beer containers to illustrate this, right?
He does.
Yeah.
You might have regulators focused on competition between glass bottles and metal cans.
Right.
But they're ignoring the fact that plastic might come along and disrupt the whole industry.
Right. And it's not just about the product itself. It's about the underlying need that the product is fulfilling. And if you're not paying attention to those changing needs, you're going to get blindsided. Okay. So Drucker offers all these critiques of traditional management assumptions, but he also proposes some new assumptions that he thinks are essential for managing in the modern world.
Yeah, he does. And one of those new assumptions is that national borders are becoming less relevant.
Because business is becoming more global.
Exactly. And he suggests that management practice is going to be increasingly defined by operational needs rather than political boundaries.
Okay.
And he also challenges this traditional inward-looking perspective of management,
Right.
this focus on the internal workings of the organization. And he argues that that has led to this artificial separation between management and entrepreneurship.
Because entrepreneurship is inherently about looking outward, about identifying opportunities in the external environment.
Exactly.
Right.
And he cautions that organizations that view these two things as mutually exclusive are going to struggle.
Yeah, they're going to miss out on a lot of opportunities for growth and innovation.
Right. And he even suggests that information technology, despite all of its potential benefits, might actually be exacerbating this inward focus in some ways.
Interesting. Okay. And then he offers this final, really overarching new management paradigm. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it kind of brings all of these ideas together.
Yeah.
And he concludes that management's concern and responsibility really need to encompass everything that impacts the institution's performance and results.
Okay.
And that includes things that are both internal and external, things that are controllable and things that are beyond their direct control.
Right. So it's really about taking a much broader view of management's role.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think this shift in paradigm really naturally leads to a discussion about the kind of information that executives need today.
Right. Because it's clearly no longer just about internal data. You
Mm.
need to be looking at external factors as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Drucker talks about how there was this initial kind of overestimation of these computer-generated business models.
Oh.
And there was this underestimation of new data processing tools as just, ways to improve existing management practices.
Right.
But what he really emphasizes is this critical need for information about customers.
Right. Because they're the ones who are ultimately generating the revenue.
Exactly. And not just customers, but non-customers.
Okay.
Why are people choosing not to do business with you?
Right. What are you missing?
Exactly. And you also need information about broader environmental trends.
Right. Like what are the social, economic, political trends that are shaping your industry?
Exactly. And he makes this interesting observation that most enterprises still haven't developed effective systems for gathering and organizing this kind of external intelligence.
Right. So they're drowning in internal data, but they're starving for real insight.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay. So what's the solution?
Well, he suggests that even large companies are going to need to rely on external specialists to navigate this vast, diverse information landscape. You got all these specialized data banks, industry journals, trade associations, government publications. I mean, the amount of information out there is just overwhelming.
Yeah, it's like drinking from a fire hose.
It is.
And not all of it is going to be relevant or accurate.
Right. And that's another important point that he makes. He says that information needs to be structured in a way that challenges and questions a company's strategic direction.
Right. It's not just about having data, it's about having insights.
Exactly. And he envisions these information services that offer very specific insights, pose relevant questions, even provide interactive consultation.
So it's almost like having an external brain trust.
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy. And he even suggests that companies might want to outsource this function to independent consultants, people he calls inside outsiders.
Okay, that's really interesting. So moving on then. Drucker also has a lot to say about management by objectives and self-control.
And this is such a fundamental concept, I think, for building truly effective teams.
Right. What's the basic idea there?
Well, Drucker's argument is that any business enterprise needs to function as a genuine team,
Okay.
where everybody's efforts are integrated towards achieving a shared objective that serves the entire business.
Right. So it's not just about individual goals, it's about how those goals align with the overall mission of the organization.
Exactly.
Right.
And each manager's role needs to be clearly aligned with that overall success.
Okay.
And their performance should be evaluated based on their contribution to those enterprise goals.
So it's really about having everyone pulling in the same direction.
Exactly. And Drucker really underscores how important it is for managers to have a clear understanding of what's expected of them, and for their superiors to communicate effectively, to provide clear feedback and to avoid misdirection and conflict.
And I think that's something that's still a challenge for a lot of organizations.
Yeah.
People aren't always on the same page.
Right.
And he even talks about how the hierarchical structure itself can unintentionally create misinterpretations.
Yeah, because subordinates will often take, even casual remarks from their superiors as being incredibly significant.
Right. Like they'll read into everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so it's really important to be clear about expectations and to provide regular feedback.
Right. So everyone knows where they stand and what they need to be doing.
And to really manage their own performance effectively, Drucker argues that managers need to be aware of their goals and have the ability to measure their progress against those goals.
Okay. So, set clear targets, track your progress, and make adjustments as needed.
Exactly. And he advocates for establishing clear and common metrics across all key business areas.
Yeah.
These don't have to be super rigid or quantitative,
Right.
but they need to be clear, simple, rational, relevant, reliable, and self-announcing.
Okay.
I mean, if you can't understand the metrics, you can't manage to them.
Right. Exactly. But then he also cautions against this overuse of reports and procedures as like these instruments of control from above.
Right. Especially when they don't serve any real purpose for the managers themselves.
Right, because all they're doing is creating more bureaucracy, more paperwork, and it's actually distracting people from their real jobs.
Exactly. And I think that's something that still resonates really strongly today.
Oh, yeah.
There's this constant demand for more and more data, more and more reporting, but it doesn't always translate into better performance.
Okay, so let's move on then to another important topic that Drucker talks about, and that's personnel decisions.
Oh, this is a good one.
Hiring and promoting.
He offers some really practical, timeless advice on making good personnel decisions.
Yeah, this is something that I think everyone struggles with at some point.
Absolutely.
So what are some of the key takeaways there?
Well, he outlines 5 rules for making good personnel decisions.
Okay.
The first rule is don't hire for minimum qualifications. Hire for what someone can do really well.
So focus on strengths.
Exactly.
Okay, what's the second rule?
The second rule is focus on strengths.
Right.
Make weaknesses irrelevant. And he gives examples of, successful leaders like Lincoln and FDR and Truman who were really good at this.
Yeah, they didn't let personal flaws get in the way of recognizing talent.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, the third rule is don't hire someone who's failed in similar jobs in the past.
Okay, so past performance is a pretty good predictor of future performance.
In a lot of cases it is.
Okay, what's the fourth rule?
The fourth rule is when you're evaluating someone, talk to several people who've worked with them.
Okay.
Not just one or two, but several.
So you can get a more well-rounded view of the person.
Exactly. And he mentions the practices of, the military, the Catholic Church, Herman Abs at Deutsche Bank.
Right. They all have these really rigorous processes for evaluating people from multiple perspectives.
Okay, and then the fifth rule is after a few months on the job, you need to make sure that the person really understands what's expected of them.
Okay. Because sometimes people come in with these assumptions about what the job is going to be like.
Right.
And it turns out to be something completely different.
And their past successes may not be relevant in this new role.
Right. So it's important to have that conversation early on to make sure that everyone is aligned on expectations.
Exactly.
Okay. That's all really good advice. And he acknowledges that, some personnel decisions are just inherently risky.
Especially when you're talking about, promoting someone from a high-performing individual contributor role to a management role.
Right.
Because those are two very different skills.
Right. Exactly. Okay. So let's shift gears again. Drucker also spends a lot of time talking about entrepreneurship.
Yeah, and he makes this really interesting argument that the biggest obstacle to entrepreneurship isn't necessarily the size of the organization.
Okay. What is it then?
It's often the existing operation.
So the inertia of the existing business.
Right.
Yeah.
Especially if it's a successful operation.
Okay.
You've got all these demands, all these crises that you're dealing with on a daily basis. And so it's easy to kind of push off these new initiatives.
Yeah, they always seem less urgent.
Right. And the problem is that